All right, welcome back once again to Module 7. We're now in lesson number 3, which is a continuation of conditions, but we're going to be talking about the non-conventional style of conditions as opposed to the conventional style which most realtors use and what most people are familiar with as well. So let's get started. So here we have a Schedule A. Now obviously this is just a sample, which is why I've got that highlighted. That normally wouldn't be there. So this would be at the top of, this is not an official Schedule A. This is not from my real estate board or anybody else's real estate board. This is one that was created privately. But again, it just shows the address. It says between the buyer and the purchaser and the seller and the vendor. So it just gives the details. And what you would do is you would take this Schedule A when you're completed and you would physically attach it to the actual purchase and sale agreement by stapling it to that agreement and making reference in the body of the purchase and sale agreement that there is a Schedule A attached. So, as we mentioned earlier in the previous lesson, the purchaser agrees to pay the balance of the purchase price subject to adjustments by bank draft or certified check to the vendor upon completion of this transaction. Again, no mention of cash because cash is not acceptable in large transactions like this anymore. But this is typically always the first clause in the Schedule A. What I suggest doing is simplifying it by simply putting in the buyer agrees to pay the balance of the purchase price in cash or by certified check to the seller on the completion of this transaction. Not a huge difference. What I've done is I've taken out the subject to adjustments. The question is, why have I done that? Well, actually, in the body of the purchase and sale agreement, you will discover that somewhere in the fine print, it will always say that the purchase price will be subject to adjustments at closing. And what subject to adjustments simply means is that property taxes will be adjusted. So if you buy it at the end of the 6th month of the year, then the taxes have been paid in full, then the seller will be credited back by the buyer for 6 months worth of taxes. If the rents have been collected, then they will be adjusted as well. So there's always going to be another common one is going to be if you have a heating system where you have an oil tank. They always fill the oil tank up to full. So if it's a 200-liter oil tank, and for argument's sake, it's $1 a liter, then there's $200. That means that at closing, the seller will be credited $200. The buyer has to pay the seller for that $200 worth of oil. So that's the subject to adjustments part of the document. But as I say, that's already dealt with in the body of the purchase and sale agreement. However, where I see it, you have that little star there. It quite clearly says that the terms and conditions of this addendum, Schedule A, shall prevail in the event of a conflict with the terms and conditions of the offer to purchase and sale form. So, if there is any conflict between what Schedule A is saying versus what the offer to purchase is saying, then Schedule A shall override the purchase agreement. The question is, why is that? Well, there's a little clause here that says, both parties agree that the sales price includes all prepaid items on the property as part of the purchase price. Well, what exactly are these prepaid items? They could be the service contract. So if there's a snow clearing contract that you pay up front, you buy the property in October and the owner has already entered into a service contract to have the snow cleared for the balance of the winter. So they've prepaid $500. That's a prepaid contract. That means that contract must be honored. Same thing with the grass cutting, alarm monitoring, or other small items like that. Property insurance can be a big one. Quite often, people will prepay their insurance for the entire year. Property taxes and oil tank, I've already talked about very quickly. But again, these items can add up to a significant amount. Now, there's no subject to adjustments at closing, which means that the snow clearing contract does not get adjusted. If it was prepaid, then it remains prepaid. That's to the buyer's benefit. Same thing with the property insurance and property taxes. Now, I'm not suggesting that you use this clause in particular when you're buying properties. However, I like to teach these types of clauses because they are out there and there are other investors using them as well. And they can potentially use these types of clauses against you. So you need to understand what they actually mean and how they're formed. All right, so this is a clause that actually I will be giving you this clause and a number of other clauses as well in a separate document. Print is very small here. Don't worry about reading this. All this is it's clause number 3. It simply says that the purchaser shall provide the following material to be signed and dated and delivered to the buyer within 5 days from acceptance of this offer. So I'm asking for the profit and loss statement for the previous 24 months. List of all equipment, fixtures, chattels included in the purchase price. All service contracts, rent rolls, copies of tenancy agreements, employment contracts, written contracts, and details of any oral agreements respecting the property. Survey of the property, copies of liens, charges, easements, etc. Copies of utility bills, evidence of having obtained a recent valid boilers inspection certificate, copies of environmental and building inspection reports pertaining to the property that may be in the possession of the vendor. Any and all fire code retrofit work required is completed and approved by the fire department. So keep in mind that I've covered a lot of stuff here that I'm asking for. You have to pick and choose what is applicable to ask for. Again, if you're buying a single family home with a gas forced air furnace, you're not going to ask for copies of environmental reports, building inspection reports, fire code retrofit, a recent valid boilers inspection certificate, etc. However, if you're buying an apartment building, then you may want to include all these things. If you're buying an apartment building and you've got elevators, then you're going to ask for all of these certificates for the elevator maintenance as well. So this just gives you an idea of what it is you're asking for, and you're asking for all of this information to be delivered to you within 5 days from acceptance of this offer. Now, I would be willing to bet money that 9 times out of 10, the seller is not prepared for when somebody asks for this information. So they will be scrambling to get the information to you, and it'll come in dribs and drabs over a period of 5 to 10 days. If the real estate agent is doing their job properly and they are familiar with commercial real estate, they should have all of this information prepared ahead of time, knowing full well that a buyer will potentially ask for and should ask for all of this information. Therefore, they have it readily available. Now, when you deal with the more experienced commercial agents, the agents who deal solely in commercial, they are well prepared. But the agents who deal primarily in single-family homes and they dabble in commercial real estate, they have no idea what all is involved, so it can be very frustrating for you. The next clause is B. So here you see that that's clause 3A, 1 through however many items that we have listed there. So that's 3A. Our next one is 3B. I was able to expand this a bit easier for reading. This offer to purchase is conditional upon the buyer or its agents conducting physical inspections, again plural, of the property and improvements thereon and being satisfied in its sole discretion with the results of such inspections, and the seller shall provide access to the buyer and his agents at all reasonable time or times in order to carry out such inspections. There's no time period attached to that yet. We go down to clause C. Again, this is all under clause number 3 though. Sub C. The buyer is to be allowed until 14 days after receipt of all documents in clause 3A, that's in the previous slide, to inspect and approve the property as per clause 3B, that's our inspection clause, and to approve in writing the documents mentioned in clause 3A. If the buyer is not satisfied as aforesaid and does not so indicate in writing, this offer shall be null and void, etc. So in other words, We're giving them 5 days to get us the information, and then we're going to ask for another 14 days to approve all that information as well as do our inspection. The next clause is number 4. And this is our finance clause. So the offer to purchase is conditional for 30 days after the waiving of all conditions in clause 3 upon the buyer or the agent obtaining at the buyer's expense mortgage financing satisfactory to himself, failing which this offer shall become null and void. So what happens here is that a lot of people will read this and they'll say, it's conditional for 30 days. Okay, it's a commercial property, I can live with that. Or they might change it down to 20 days, whatever. And it's not business days, it's straight out days. Now, could just as easily ask for 20 business days, which would be 4 weeks, which would be close to being the same as 30 days, or I could have asked for 30 banking days or business days as well, which would give me even more time. Now, so it's similar to the standard clause in the previous lesson, but these time frames have been stacked. So in reality, we asked for 5 days to get the information, then we asked for 14 days to review it and approve it, and then an additional 30 days for our financing. So in total, we have 49 days for this property to be tied up for diligence. Now, why would I do that? Well, if I'm looking at doing an assignment, for example, and I need as much time as I can get in order to find somebody in order to find somebody to assign this deal to, then I need to give myself more time. And if I was to ask for 40 or 50 days conditional, most likely the seller is not going to give it to me. Now, if I think they will give it to me, then I'll simply ask for it. I won't worry about stacking the time. But more often than not, you may need to be a little bit creative in stacking your clauses in order to get the time required. You also need to keep in mind that when you do find somebody, let's say that you are 15 days into this transaction, and you just find somebody now in order to do the assignment. Well, you may have to go ahead and do the inspection yourself and document everything so that the person who is buying that property that you're assigning it to can take a look at the inspection report and be happy with it. But they still have time in order to get their financing in place as well. So that's why you need to stack all this time in. All right, this offer is subject to the approval of the purchaser's partner and lawyer. So there's your lawyer clause. This is another one. If you are buying a property that you're going to be rehabbing and flipping, especially if it's already vacant, the purchaser shall receive a key to the property and the right to enter for purpose of physical improvements to the property and to show the property to any and all prospective renters or buyers at any time prior to closing. So if you have this clause in your purchase and sale agreement and all other clauses have been satisfied, the deal is now firm, meaning you're committed to it, then what this is allowing you to do is enter into the property ahead of time. Maybe you just need to clean it, paint it, prep it, get it ready for showings or for renting. And it's a reasonable request, because if you wait until the day that you own it, then you get in there and you have to paint it and clean it, and it's a week later, then you start to show it. It's going to be a month to 2 months before you get a potential tenant in there. You're losing money. If you can get in ahead of time and get this work done so that you can get tenants occupying it as soon as possible, maybe even a day or two after you buy it, then that's saving you money. Absolutely nothing wrong from your perspective in doing this. Now, the question is there anything wrong with either of these two clauses, though? Well, when you take a look closely at clause number 1, you'll notice that there's no date. And what that means, if that's accepted, that means that you can, up until the day of closing, you can say, you know what, my partner doesn't like it, my lawyer doesn't like it, I want out of the deal. Now, that can be a challenge, because that could be argued in a court of law, and if it does go to a court of law, the judge may or may not throw it out. So it is a little bit of a gray area. However, more often than not, when people want out of a deal, it's pretty easy to get out of a deal, especially the commercial deals, because it's not connected to people being like the domino effect. Whereas in residential houses, if one house doesn't close on time, it's going to affect other buyers down the line as well. So it can get pretty hairy with single-family homes. So it is surprising the number of times I have tried this in the past. I don't use this anymore myself, but when I first started out, I would throw this clause in there, and it was sort of a 50-50 chance whether the real estate agent and or the seller noticed that, and they either stroked it out or they put a date in there. The other thing is with number 2, if you are the seller in this case and somebody requests this of you for the property that you are selling, never, ever, ever allow this to take place, because the challenge is, from the seller's perspective, you are not insured. Their insurance does not cover you. There's a huge liability risk. What happens if somebody gets hurt while on the property working? Also, there's a potential for squatting. So you could occupy that property, or the buyer could occupy the property and then decide not to close, but they're occupying the property like a tenant. So it just creates lots of potential issues from the seller's perspective. So be aware of that, depending on which side of the fence you're on, whether you ask for it or you deny it. Cashback. Cashback is more difficult to do now than it ever has been. Cashback used to be a very popular and easy to achieve thing to do in real estate. Cashback is still legal. A lot of people will hear or claim that cashback is illegal. I even had a real estate broker, before I had my license recently here, I bought a property, and the agent that was representing me was also a real estate broker. I asked for a cashback clause to be inserted in the offer, and he said, no, you can't do that, that's illegal. And I argued with him and said, in fact, that it is legal. What's illegal is if you try and hide it, if you don't disclose it, that then becomes fraud. What I was proposing was just asking for cashback. So if the bank accepts the clause, then they've agreed to it. It's not illegal. The bank may have a policy that they don't allow it, but if they read the contract and they accept the contract as it was written, then they didn't turn it down, then it moves forward. So here's a typical cashback clause that's used on a regular basis. Seller agrees to credit to the purchaser at closing the amount of $3,500 to cover all closing costs, including but not limited to legal fees, inspection fees, appraisal fees, finance fees, as well as compensate for minor repairs. Now you can word it in a variety of different ways. You can say $1,000 to clean up the yard, to compensate to clean up the yard afterwards. You can say $5,000 to install new windows. Whatever it is, you can word it however you want. This is just an example. Now, I wrote that same cashback clause below. It says the exact same thing. Seller agrees to credit to the purchaser at closing the amount of $3,500 to cover all closing costs, including but not limited to legal fees, inspections, appraisal fees, finance fees, as well as compensate for minor repairs. The exact same thing. Well, if it's the exact same thing, then what's the difference between the two clauses? It's these three very subtle changes. So again, keep in mind that what happens is when you fill out your purchase and sale agreement and you apply for financing, this purchase and sale agreement, a copy of it is going to be sent to the lender. And the lender is going to take a look at the purchase and sale agreement. They're going to read through it. Now you have to keep in mind this isn't going to your local bank branch anymore. This goes to head office. So at head office, there's some poor schmuck sitting there. They walk into their office Monday morning and they see this pile of purchase and sale agreements they need to go through and approve. And the pile just never seems to go away. Now, they start to get a little bit lazy by Wednesday and Thursday. They're looking towards the weekend. So they start scanning. What they're doing is they're looking for red flags. Well, in that first clause, the red flags, the capital 3, the capital 5, and the number 3,500 jump out. When you remove that, and you just write it as I have it in the second paragraph there, it means the exact same thing, but it doesn't jump out to people. So it's less likely to be picked up. And if it's not picked up and it's stamped approved, then you've got your cash back. Other ways of getting cash back are to have a clause where the seller agrees to pay the land transfer tax. And again, it's a very subtle statement, and it depends where you live, how much that land transfer tax is, whether it even is applicable. You can also ask to have the seller agree to pay all legal fees, and you could put a maximum amount in there. Seller agrees to do prior to closing whatever, so for example, the seller agrees to empty the entire yard of all junk prior to closing, failing which the buyer will hold back or credit the purchaser purchase price $1,000, etc. Knowing full well that they're not going to clean out the backyard, or maybe there's not even $1,000 worth of stuff to clean out in the backyard. There's different ways of writing these clauses. Now, what I've done is I've included a copy of the Schedule A with the creative clauses, as well as Schedule A from a former colleague, Eric, just to give you an example of some clauses as well. Eric's is not creative, but they are more commercial related as well. Keep in mind that this is just an example of clauses. You have to pick and choose what you use. Do not use all of the clauses in any one deal at a time. Just because I've got them all listed out in one Schedule A doesn't mean that's what I would do in one offer. I had a student contact me. Actually, I had a realtor friend contact me who was representing a student of mine, asking me to step in and speak with my student because my student actually took my Schedule A and literally copied it, all of it, into a purchase and sale agreement, and I had to explain again that you don't use all of it. You just use what's applicable for each and every case. All right, so that's it for this lesson. Again, any questions, feel free to contact me. Otherwise, I look forward to speaking with you on the live webinar. Thanks very much.